Hi everyone, it's Simone Watson, and this, I believe, is part 4 of my series on classifying your manuscript. Today I want to talk about historical fiction, contemporary fiction, and a relatively new term that has, been used recently called nostalgic fiction. I am sorry if I look sweaty. It's because the air conditioner is out in my house, and I went to film outside, but there were some giant wasps, and I was like, no. So, okay, let's get into the video. I really like the term nostalgic fiction, but I don't know if it's really caught on widely yet. Nostalgic fiction is it's fiction that's between contemporary and historical. It's not old enough to be called historical, but it's not quite new, like the era. It's not, long enough ago to be called historical, but it's not contemporary either. I like to use this term. I know that some people maybe haven't even heard of this term because I've seen people like agents tweeting that if your book takes place in the 90s, it's historical fiction. I completely disagree with that. I'm trying not to make it personal because I know I was born in the 90s, but I don't think that books that take place in the 90s should be called historical fiction. And I think that this is why it's necessary to have this distinction. So the exact range of historical fiction is debated widely. I don't know about widely, it's debated. And necessarily the range of contemporary fiction is debated, and then the range of nostalgic fiction, I haven't even heard anyone define it. I like to think of nostalgic fiction as mostly 15 to 35 years before the book comes out. And that's something we should talk about, is release date. So I like to think of it as 15 to 35 years ago. So if a book comes out right now and it takes place from 1983 to 2003, I think of that as nostalgic fiction. And then I think of like after 2003 as maybe being called contemporary fiction. But you may go as far as like 10 years ago being nostalgic, and on the like upper end of nostalgic, you might go to 45, you might even go to 50 years. But once you get to like 50 years ago, once you get to 1968 and earlier, that probably would be called historical fiction in most circles. But otherwise you can just use like whatever other distinction whatever other like genres it fits into, because it may fit into other genres. So I just want to talk about a few examples because this is such a tough discussion. I feel like when we get into examples, that can kind of help discuss some of the factors that may come into this. Okay, so one thing is that I read an article where someone called the book Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson historical fiction. This is wildly inaccurate, in my opinion, and I think in a lot of people's opinion. Speak is not historical fiction. Speak is firmly contemporary fiction. I'm trying to remember what year it came out, and I can't remember. I think it was in the early 2000s, but it's not historical fiction because it comes out it takes place at the same time that the book comes out. So the book's release date is something to keep in mind, because a book that came out in the 60s and takes place in the 60s is different from a book that comes out now and takes place in the 60s. I actually do have examples of this. Sorry, it's a slightly weird angle. Okay, so this is If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. This is a book that came out in the 1970s and took place in the 1970s. So this is contemporary fiction, even though the book is kind of old. There is a historical fiction society. I probably should have mentioned this earlier. And the Historical Fiction Society has a definition of historical fiction. They define it as something that takes place 50 years before the book's release date or before the birth of the author. I don't think they mean 50 years before the birth of the author. I think they mean it takes place before the birth of the author. I may have to double check that. Yeah, before. it's definitely if it takes place before the birth of the author, because you can't say 50 years. Anyway, yeah. So before the birth of the author or 50 years before the book's release date, okay? So this is James Baldwin book. This is contemporary fiction. I believe that this also is contemporary fiction. I think it's based on James Baldwin's childhood, but he wasn't that old when he wrote this. Like, I do not know how old he was. So I'm not sure, but the book came out in 1953. I want to say it took place in the 1940s or 30s. So you might call that nostalgic fiction. That's a tough question, especially when it's, anything that's based on the author's childhood. That does kind of make it a tough question. Okay, so this is Time Bomb by Joël Charbonneau. This is contemporary fiction. Yeah, it came out this year and it takes place around this year. It is about some students waiting in a school while there is a time bomb that I guess is set to go off soon. Now this is one, I haven't read it to know the tone or anything, but it might also be considered, it's probably also considered a suspense novel. And I talked about mysteries, thrillers, and suspense before, and I usually don't think of them when classifying contemporary fiction, but you could still a lot of times call one a contemporary fiction. So there you go. This is an example of an actual historical fiction novel, River Across My Heart by Brina Clark. This takes place in the 1920s, and it came out, I forgot when it came out, so I'm going to check the date. It came out in 1999. It takes place in the 1920s, so this is definitely historical fiction. Sorry, I had to stand up. Okay. Again, we have a firmly contemporary fiction novel. I should also note, the term contemporary fiction is something that you definitely hear in YA and in middle grade. You don't hear it as much in adult fiction because the contemporary novels are divided up further into literary, upmarket, sometimes commercial, women's fiction. So there are those subcategory, like subgenres, and I will try to make a video about that soon, okay? But yeah, this is firmly contemporary fiction. This does take place now. Now, this is interesting because there are books that have historical in the name of the genre, but they do have speculative elements, okay? So here we have Dread Nation by Justina Ireland. You might call this historical fantasy. It is about a girl who fights zombies in the Civil War era South. Would that be fantasy? I think it's either fantasy or like paranormal. So it might be historical paranormal fiction, but this is YA. This one was also YA. I think River Across My Heart is adult, possibly literary fiction. Not sure. This is contemporary fiction. All We Can Do Is Wait by Richard Lawson. And as you probably know, from in general, or if you've seen my video on classifying YA contemporary, contemporary generally does mean things with no speculative elements, things that take place in the real world, and are somewhat current. We do have things like this. This is The Hand I Fan With by Tina McElroy Ansah. I believe it's about a woman who, she does some kind of supernatural thing, ghost ritual, and brings to life a ghost and dates him. But it takes place in the present. This might be contemporary fantasy, or it might be magical realism / contemporary with magical elements. I'm not sure. But I just thought I would bring that up because sometimes you do hear contemporary with magical elements being used to describe fiction. And I probably should do a whole video on magical realism and contemporary with magical elements. That might be something to give its own video, even though I did talk about it in the video about speculative fiction, okay? Yeah, so another example of a book that is just old would be this one, Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. This came out in 1937. I believe it takes place around that time. I could be wrong, though. I read this book, but it was like, I was in middle school, I think. It was a while ago. People love Zora Neale Hurston around where I'm from because she's from around the same area, so it's pretty exciting. And lastly, we have this book, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. This came out, let me see. Oh, okay, the back of the book says this came out in 1962. This is a 50th anniversary edition. But the book came out in 1962 and took place during World War II. So you actually might call that nostalgic fiction. But yeah, you wouldn't call it historical fiction. So you can see where sometimes this gets uncertain. And then we have this book, which is really big. My favorite thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris. When did this come out? I want to say 2014. And it takes place in the 60s, I think. Yeah, late 1960s. So it's not quite 50 years. This is where you might call it historical. You might call it nostalgic. Because it's less than 50 years, but it's more than 35. So your mileage may vary, but you might, I don't know. I want to say just go with historical, but now I'm not sure. So there is one that kind of gives us pause, so to speak. But now I have a few books that probably would be considered nostalgic fiction. And these can kind of show why one might want to write nostalgic fiction. Now, as I've showed you, James Baldwin wrote a book that I think was based on his childhood. So sorry. Probably should put that on silent. And so that's a reason to make nostalgic fiction, because you want to talk about something that affected you as a child. The way the world was when you were a child, etc. Here we have The Memory Keeper's Daughter by Kim Edwards. This came out in, I want to say 2004. I just looked at it. I'm just going to say 2004. And yeah, and it starts off in 1964. Wait, did it come out in 2008? I'm sorry, it came out in 2008. Starts off in 1964. I think that's the case. This is about a doctor who has a daughter with Down syndrome, and he has two twins. He delivers them, and his wife is unconscious, and he can tell that the girl and boy, there's a girl and boy, he can tell that the girl has Down syndrome, and so he tells his nurse to take her away and put her in like a what do you call it? Like a home for people with Down syndrome. But he lies to his wife about it and says that the baby died. It's really sad, and that's a really terrible thing to do, but it could be that the author chose to the author chose to write about that era because of the way that Down syndrome was viewed and the way that developmental disabilities were viewed at that time. So she chose to explore that time period for that reason. And the book does not just take place in 1964. It goes from then to about the 80s. So that for me, like, firmly plants it in the nostalgic fiction genre. Okay. Then we have things like this: Mama Flora's Family by Alex Haley and David Stevens. I believe David Stevens finished this book when Alex Haley died. This is about a family, so it goes through many generations. This is another one where it's like, is it historical though? Is it nostalgic? Not sure. It's hard to say if this is historical or nostalgic. If you know Alex Haley, he is very famous for writing Roots. He also wrote Queen. Both of those are true family sagas. Those are, Roots is the story of his mom's family. Queen is the story of his dad's family. And those are true, even though they had to fill in some details and kind of fictionalize it. But this is fictional. It is a family saga. I don't even know if family sagas can be called nostalgic, so maybe you would just call this historical because of the family saga. Maybe you would just say family saga and leave it there. And And the last book I have like to show you and like hold in my hands and show you is this one, Big Girls Don't Cry by Connie Briscoe. Now, this one is similar to The Memory Keeper's Daughter and Mama Flora's Family in that it starts off at one time and the book progresses throughout multiple decades. This one starts off in the 1960s when maybe desegregation was, happening in the schools and different things like that. And it is about a black girl, but it came out in 1996 or 98, I think. And so she it goes from her childhood until she's maybe middle-aged or in her 30s or something like that, and just details her life, especially as race has affected her life. I did read this a while ago, quite a few years ago. So so these are our different books that give us examples of what might be called historical fiction, might be nostalgic, etc. So for those books that are between 35 and 50 years ago, you may have a question, but you can often probably call those historical. I don't know. Then, okay. Some agents and editors have recently said, they say two things. One, they say don't write nostalgic fiction because they don't think that there's much of a demand for books that take place in the 90s, the 20-aughts. I think there is demand for those that take place in the 80s. So, I wouldn't say, but maybe they think that there's not that either. I don't know. No, I think the 80s are safe. But some don't want you to write in the 90s and the 20-aughts. Some also have said you can write in that era, but you want a reason for your book to be set in that era. And so, as I've said, The Memory Keeper's Daughter, the author, I think, made the choice to set in the 1960s because the perception of Down syndrome, the perception of developmental disabilities, was different back then and was perhaps changing, over the course of the time that the book took place. And the doctor, as I've said, he lies about his daughter having Down syndrome. And it really messes up a lot of things, the fact that he lied. This book is not condoning that. I'm not saying it's a good book, but it's not condoning that extremely ableist action. So basically, that happens in the 60s, and then it seems like around that time, from what I could tell, I may need to do more research on this, but it even though some people with Down syndrome were sent to live in these group home type places, it wasn't everybody, right? So if you want to explore something about that era, that may be a good reason to write nostalgic fiction. A particular historical event that was happening. This may be another question, is if you write your book about 9/11, the 9/11 attacks, or Hurricane Katrina, is that historical because it's an important historical event? Or the tsunami, there was that book, what's the book called? When I Found You, I think that's the name of the book that I read, I actually DNF'd it a few months ago, but that one took place around 2005, had to do with the tsunami in, why do I keep wanting to say Thailand and then feeling like it's not Thailand? There was a tsunami though. There was a big tsunami in 2004, I think. Thailand. I think it was Thailand. So that does deal with a specific event. You also have books like Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward that took place, When I Found You came out in 2010, so that would be considered contemporary. Then it was re-released in 2017. Still probably contemporary, but again, has to do with that historical event, so I don't know. Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward came out, I think, in 2016, and was about Hurricane Katrina, or it had to do with, took place around the time of Hurricane Katrina. And the plot, directly involved Hurricane Katrina. You have some books that are specifically affected or specifically center around the 9/11 attacks. You have some books. Oh, there's a book that's about to come out by Tahira Mafi. It's called, what is this book called? I'm so sorry, I can't remember the title, but it is nominated for a National Book Award. So that should be really good. And it's about, I believe it's about a Muslim girl facing Islamophobia in 2002, a year after the 9/11 attacks. And so the 9/11 attacks are important to that plot, but not in the plot. It doesn't happen during the book. So I probably would call that nostalgic fiction. And most fiction about the 9/11 attacks that comes out recently, I would call nostalgic fiction. So you may want to do that, to write nostalgic fiction because of something that's specifically, a specific event that's in that era that, had a huge impact. And you might want to write nostalgic fiction because of memories, okay? Some books have to do with, the characters now versus how they were then, how they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I keep saying 10 years ago, and then I said that wasn't in the range, so I'm sorry. But again, 10 might count, I don't know. But recently the book Queen of Hearts came out, and that's about these two doctors, in present day, but then it like flashes back to the 90s when they were in medical school because something important happened. And so it's like a dual timeline thing. Or you have the book This Love Story Will Self-Destruct, which is like When Harry Met Sally. So, and it's sort of like those ones that go through the decades, but this doesn't go through the decades exactly. It goes through quite a few years in a row of two characters falling for each other. So these are all these are a bunch of different reasons you might want to write as nostalgic fiction. These are just possibilities, and I'm hoping that we can use the term nostalgic fiction more, because unfortunately, even though some literary agents have said if your book takes place in the 90s, it's historical fiction, I don't think that when readers look for historical fiction, I don't think that's what they're looking for. And this is why we have genre classifications, is so that readers can know what they're picking up. That's one of the main reasons. Okay, so we wouldn't want to call something historical fiction and then, readers pick it up and it's not what they expect. But a lot of times it will be defined by the publishing house, in particular. Some publishing houses are like, World War II and earlier. That's what they call historical fiction. So different things like that. So I'm not saying that you can't call your book historical fiction if it takes place in the 90s, but you might want to ask your beta readers. You might want to ask your beta readers. But you can't call it contemporary. So that's what makes it that catch-22, where I'm basically coming back to my point again, but that I think nostalgic fiction is a good thing to call it. And nostalgic does not mean that it's happy or that the audience is going to remember it. It's just the term for the fiction, okay? It doesn't mean like, oh, yay. Because obviously we're talking about things that have to do with the 9/11 attacks. That's not happy, but it's something that a lot of us remember. But even the teens reading it may not remember it because they're teens. They may not have been around, but because it is so recent, again, nostalgic fiction. And of course, all those books that start off decades ago and then come here, it can be very confusing. So I feel like the answer I'm giving you is kind of, I don't know. I'm not giving you concrete answers, but just know that if your book, the general consensus is if it takes place in World War II and earlier, it's definitely historical fiction. In the late 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, probably historical fiction. In the 70s, probably a little bit less certain. And then when you get closer, you may want to call it nostalgic fiction, okay? And then there will be subgenres based on which era your book takes place in. So you may sometimes see Regency and different things like that, especially in romance. I hear the term Regency romance a lot. Okay, so thank you for bearing with me. I know this was a long video, but I hope that it was somewhat helpful, and informative to you. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, or you can tell me, your favorite book that is from any of these three, or tell me if there's any, like, the way I'm like fighting for nostalgic fiction to be recognized as a genre. Like, is there any genre that you would like fight for, that you would go to bat for, and you don't see people using it a lot? I would love to know. Okay, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on Wednesday. Bye.